Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where we find you today. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I'm the Associate Director of Policy at the Africa Center. And if you've joined us for programming in the past, we're happy to have you back. And if you're with us for the first time, welcome. Before we get started, just a little bit about the Africa Center. We are a multidisciplinary institution concerned primarily with global narratives about Africa. So we think it's important what information gets to shape our understanding of Africa, but also who gets to mold and shape that understanding as well. And as part of that work, we put on public programs, primarily in the fields of arts and culture, policy, and business. And obviously this is a policy program. And so yeah, we do put on programs such as this one to try to convince the public that a lot of these issues that we care about and we think are going to be important for Africa are actually worth their time. And today's program is going to be on the space industry in Africa and the implications for the future. And to help us better understand this, we are joined by a panel of experts who will help us get smarter about a lot of these issues. First, we have Imraan Saloojee, who is Executive Director at the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability, headquartered in Johannesburg. He's had an extensive career in the space sector, spanning more than 2 decades across the continent. And his research and policy interests center primarily around strengthening private sector involvement in the African space ecosystems and building sustainable space innovations across Africa. We're also joined by Elsabeth Tesfayohannes Tedros, excuse me, who's currently the Principal Program Officer at the African Union Development Agency as part of its NEPAD initiative. NEPAD is the New Partnership for African Development. And in this role, she works to leverage effective public-private engagements for stronger development outcomes. And last but not least, of course, we are joined by Aikohi, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Space in Africa, which is a leading media analytics and consulting company that's focused on the African space and satellite industry. They're based in Lagos, Nigeria, but I suspect she's currently elsewhere. Anna has also co-authored several influential publications on the space industry in Africa, including the Africa Space Industry Annual Report, the Global Space Budget Report, and the New Space Africa Industry Report. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you. And I think we can actually get right into it. I'd like to start with you, Imraan, if that's okay. We're going to speak about the space sector in some detail, and I think to start, it would be good to get a sense of what the full picture of that looks like. So if you could you please just summarize the current state of space programs or the space industry in general across the continent, just a brief history, where we are now, and sort of what they do. I'm sorry, and how they're funded, pardon me.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. I think the question you're asking is hugely important. Getting the full picture, not only from the past, which is a very rich history of space in Africa, but also the current activities that are happening. The organization that I come from, the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability, has done some work to start documenting the history of space in Africa. And there's a wiki page that's called the History of Space in Africa that we've established with through doing some desktop research, as well as interviews with leading space actors on the continent, both currently active and those that have been active in the past as well. It's a resource that we're making available, and it's on an open platform like Wiki, and looking to receiving lots more contributions from the community at large. When we're thinking around space in Africa, I think that as I indicated, there's a long history of space. Both in the looking up portion of space, astronomy and space sciences, but also the looking down portion of space, Earth observations and satellite navigation and communication type of activities. Astronomy is probably goes back the furthest. For example, there's the South African Astronomical Observatory based in Cape Town was established in 1820. And together with that, a magnetic observatory called the Hermanus Magnetic Observatory, which provides important data relating to the geomagnetic field and the study of the near Earth space environment, which were, as well as these days doing satellite weather, space weather predictions. That was established in around 1841. These are just
sorry, and these are generally they're state owned, they're state run.
Yes, they state-funded, state-run entities. I think the bulk of the activity in Africa in space is publicly funded and publicly run entities. Today, we have some major infrastructure being developed on the continent to look at astronomy. The Square Kilometre Array Telescope, which is a radio astronomy observatory with a collecting area of around 1 square kilometer. It's situated across 2 continents in Africa, and the array is situated in Africa and in Australia, with the bulk of the array being in Africa and spread over a number of countries: South Africa, Botswana, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zambia. There's also, because of its geographical position and paradoxically the lack of development, Southern African region is quite good for astronomy, and you find that there's an astronomy complex being developed within Southern Africa. The HESS High Energy Stereoscopic System telescope that is also located in Namibia. And there's also the Southern African Large Telescope that is also located here. Other observatories, sorry.
So it sounds like the bulk of this work is concentrated in Southern Africa, but I wonder if you have a sense of how many countries in Africa are there legitimate space-based or space-focused initiatives or programs that you can point to. Do you have a sense of how many countries?
There's around 14 or 15 countries across the continent that have established space programs. There's Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Angola, amongst those that have established space programs. The majority of activities is on the looking down portion of space, on Earth observation related type of activities, and using space as a vantage point to image the Earth, to be able to understand Earth system processes, understand human activity on space, to provide an information base for decision-making processes related to the major challenges that we face as humankind. Climate change, looking at disaster mitigation, food security, water security. So very much a lot of the space-related programs, some of it focused on feeding the curiosity of us as human beings. Others very much practically focused on providing the very necessary information that we require to be able to improve quality of life, as well as improve the economic well-being of people.
So I think that's an important point I want us to touch on before we move on, is this idea that these space programs have existed in the country for a long time. They're all engaged in not exactly the same things, right? And I think there's maybe a sense when we talk about space or space related things that it's an indulgent. It's what rich countries do because they have time, right? It is an engagement of opulence, so to speak. And I wonder, I know that I think I even with my little knowledge, I understand that that's a bit of a misconception, but do you mind clarifying when we say space programs, what are they doing? Is it really staring at the clouds and trying to go, because I think we may be associated with what space is in popular culture now, which I think is veering towards the billionaires with too much time on their hands kind of narrative. So what are space programs in Africa doing?
So, I mean, I think that you need to take both the sort of looking up and looking down portion of it. I mean, this misconception really stems from perceptions of space being about, space exploration, going to Mars, going to the moon, looking for life in other parts of the universe as well. And I think that's a legitimate curiosity-driven type of endeavor that we as Africans need to have. A lot of the astronomy type of facilities and the engagement of astronomers and space scientists on the continent are looking at that curiosity-driven type of research and contributing to a global knowledge base, an important contribution from the African continent into the global knowledge base. So I wouldn't knock the idea of space exploration and looking out into the heavens and to be able to understand, our origins, etc., type of thing as well. But the majority of space programs on the continent are really focused on the looking down portion of it and into how do we use space as a vantage point to address and provide the information that is required, the predictive capabilities, the analytical capabilities that is required for us to be able to make important and good decisions about our well-being on the planet, our relationship with the environment, our relationship, our human activities and its impact on the environment.
So space matters, I think, in many contexts across society, and I think, but I want to come to you, Elsa, and this idea, because I think with many policy-focused topics in Africa, I think funding gets to be the elephant in the room for everything, right? No matter how well-designed, well-intentioned it is, nothing can happen unless you fund it. And you coming from the international development and financing space, I wonder what you would identify as sort of being institutional priorities for development funding. Like, is this, do you guys care about this, so to speak? Oh, Elsa, I'm sorry, I think you might be muted.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Thank you so much, Tunde and the Africa Center. Apologies for blacking out earlier. We had load shedding in South Africa, and I was transitioning into my data. But thank you so much for having me. And I think there are two parts to your question, which is the first part, what do we identify as the priority areas? And the opinion that I have here, I'm sure you mentioned earlier, but it is of mine and not of Auda Nepad. So as a development finance expertise. So from what I've seen in non-necessary order, the funding, some of the development funding areas for Africa include infrastructure development, and infrastructure development including energy, transport, water, ICT, which is kind of linked to space investments somehow, and I'll get to that. And then you have social infrastructure with health and education, and then lastly, but not least, agriculture and renewable energy. And the previous panelist has rightfully mentioned this, to say that renewable energy is at the forefront, given climate, or global warming and climate finance issues that we're having at the current time. And this is critical to support long-term economic growth in the continent. So now we go to the second part of your question is, as for funding for space program funding in Africa. And I think the first fundamental question we have to understand is contextualizing. And I think the Africa Center does an exceptional job in doing just that. It reminds me of our conversation today to say that are we flying out to Mars, or are we going to look for other boundaries to live in? But I like the contextualization. Are we looking down or are we looking up? And I'm looking at, and my information, my observation on financing will be looking down. because that's more on the commercial side. So let me start with is to think about this misconception demystifying is done. What's the process I've also learned to contextualize and dive into space investment in Africa, which is not my expertise, but it links to how we're looking at infrastructure financing. Okay, it is clear that many African countries are still developing in capabilities. They may lack the resources or institutional appetite for large-scale initiatives, which is very capital intensive. So that's a very difficult thing to do. Infrastructure finance, capital intensive, space investment, significantly even more so. So if anything, from what I observed, most of the investments is academically driven, as we have talked earlier. However, some African countries, as mentioned, South Africa and Nigeria and Egypt, I think have looked at it from a commercial point of view. So let's go a little bit deeper. So developing their space programs, actively investing, seeking funding, partnerships. So in recent years, several African countries have launched their own satellites, okay? And development partnerships with other countries and organizing to build capacity and space technology. So what are the classic sources of funding for development? I'm going to give it from the high level. So number one is international organizations. Number one is the multilateral development agencies, MDBs, which is the World Bank Group and others, and the UN. And then you have development finance institutions, which is the DFIs, the IFCs, the AFDBs, the US Development Finance Corporation and others. And lastly, you have the donors agency, which is USAID. So these organizations have a strong focus on development sustainability. And now they are aligning that to sustainable goals of SDGs, the Agenda 2063, and to some extent, they're now aligning with Africa's space programs. So DFIs, primarily AFDB, EIB, DBSA, and others, have actively invested in space-related projects. I can give two examples. For instance, the AFDB is now invested in the regional communication infrastructure programs. I won't go too much in deep to it, but IFC has done the same. The second is the private sector plays a critical role in infrastructure. We'll discuss that a little bit further later. I'm looking at my timing. So the last and most important is the public sector. So that is the major funder of infrastructure. And if not in space now, what is needed is the public-private partnership that's necessary to leverage the private sector into that investment. I'll stop there, and I think as we go along, we'll discuss further. But it's a very vast and big topic, and it's difficult to capture in 2 minutes. But
no, I certainly accept that, but I want to stay on this idea of private sector participation in the space and come to you and ask. Sort of in your work, how would you characterize the current level of private sector involvement in this space? Is it mostly governments that are engaged in this work in Africa?
So the primary engagement, like I said, is very academic.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I addressed this to Anna. My apologies. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're fine. Sorry. Anna, I think you might be muted. You might be muted.
Yes.
Oh, I don't think your sound's coming through, unfortunately. Okay, while you try to fix that, Elsa, do you want to take it?
Sure. Yeah, so most of the public sector funding is quite low. I mean, the African Union has it under the Agenda 2063 to have this flagship Africa Our Space strategy. So they're trying to get some investment through there, but I think that private sector investment is the dominant of space investment when you look at satellite. And it's usually external, like France, Luxembourg, and other Asian countries that are investing. So mostly private sector.
Okay, cool. And did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to maybe add 2 points to that. I mean, I think that I think when you're looking at the space sector, you need to be looking at it from the entire value chain. The infrastructure component of it, the satellite and the toys up in space, etc., is one component of it. But I think that you need to be also looking at it on the more downstream side. You know, what is happening to the data that is coming from space and how is that being turned into useful products and services that can be used elsewhere. And I think there's a huge involvement of the private sector. Having to come in, there's a number of SMMEs and small entities, small companies coming in that are providing observations and information and analytics and predictive capabilities using space-based data. So I think that when we're talking around the space ecosystem, we need to be looking at it from along the entire value chain. Even at the upstream of that, there's a number of companies that are coming in, private sector companies that have built and launched satellites and providing services from that as well. So I think there's quite a big diversity of players within the space sector.
In the space, we got Anna back. I want to jump on back to you, Anna. Do you want to jump in?
Okay, so please confirm you can hear me now.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I was saying that yes, I would say there's a lot of involvement in the private sector. So we have over 300 private space companies that are operating in Africa presently. 90% of these are operating in downstream sectors, so they cut across different segments, satellite communication, astronomy, research capacity development, and so on. And some of which have received funding, so they've gotten funding from different places, and some of which are even generating like a lot of revenue. We see their impact in the African space programs. And in fact, I would say that, like Imraan mentioned about space programs earlier, we presently have about 24 countries with space programs in Africa, and some of these countries, it's even the private sectors that are really driving them. We have like the most active private sectors in the space industry in Africa, in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt. We have more space companies there, but I would say it's very active. We have a lot of innovations. In fact, some of these private companies are even servicing markets outside of Africa, so global markets. Some of them have been involved in international business combinations and so many other things. So I would say there's a real booming private sector. We see that there's still, and the African space industry is still in its infancy. There's a lot of growth that we anticipate. But for now, I'll say the private sector is doing quite well.
Okay. I think that's really helpful. I think we have a sense of what the full picture of the industry looks like on the continent. I want to shift to some less.
Okay. Just quickly, if I may, just to wrap up, and I think this will guide us in our other discussions. I think Imraan raises a very good point on upstream, because that's one of the things that we look at in infrastructure. So perhaps looking at it from perspective of supply and demand is also important. So because how I was looking at it is as an investor, as as a supplier, rather than from the demand side. So I think the demand definitely is from the public sector side, and that's definitely a space to look at. So I think we have to look at it from a perspective it's from the supply side or the demand side of space investments. Thank you.
No, I think that's really important. Thank you. And it would seem from you guys' comments, there's a sense that the industry is definitely, it's nascent, but it's growing, and the outlook is positive. And I think we've talked about this in our conversations earlier, but I think it's whenever we talk about Africa in relation to the rest of the world, I think this issue of sovereignty seems to come up, and how I think there are many signs that the continent is trying to carve out a more self-determined future for itself going forward. And I wonder how space infrastructure fits into this, sort of who a lot of this stuff is for common use. The stuff out there right now is for common use, but I wonder, I'll come to you, Imraan, does it sort of matter who owns the stuff up there, and could it complicate the future that we're trying to build for ourselves?
I think it does matter, and it matters from the perspective of having direct and independent access to space to be able to get the data that you require at the time that you require it as well. Now, and I think that this particularly is important on the high end of where commercial space operators work in certain, the high resolution type of data and the synthetic aperture radar type of data as well. There have been instances where access to some of this data has been restricted for numerous reasons, or there hasn't been availability of data, or you're quite low down in the queue of access to or imaging type of thing. When we look at it back to some of the policy priorities that are within the continent, whether it's the SDGs or whether it's something like the science and technology, innovation strategy, or the space policies, I think there's a number of these policies that depend on having good data to be able to implement them. For us to be able to make an impact on the SDGs, for example, we need to have an understanding of what is happening in our environment, and not being able to have access to the data at the time that we require for that becomes a bit of a problem. So yes,
security. So security and access to the data ultimately becomes more important. I think it's the same thing with digitization in general, right? I think there's a fear in Africa that if all these data centers are in Pennsylvania somewhere, I don't really have as much control over security over my information as I might want. I want to come back to you, Anna. This question, I think in popular culture, for the most part, when we think about space, the overwhelming fear is of some sort of war kind of thing breaking up, but they're just going to pack our atmosphere or whatever it is with lasers, and they can blow you out from in the sky. You go to these conferences, you talk to people involved in these spaces, and I wonder, to what extent is that overblown? How much of the industry is this offensive type advancements versus some of the other things we've talked about in disaster relief, climate, and all those things?
Okay, so I would say like I don't think people in the industry would be of that opinion. I would say it's mostly people who are not quite informed about what space can do. So it's people who are not quite informed that would think that, oh, it's just, using this technology for war, or maybe just going to the moon or to Mars or just outer space. But at the conferences, we also, at the events and conferences, we are also educating, the layman who has no knowledge about space. But we also have like top space professionals there who are quite conversant with what space can do. I mean, space can be used for so many things. Let's even just look at Earth observation and remote sensing, how it's used to, track disaster, keep track of it, used for preventive measures, how it can be used in sectors like agriculture, help farmers to plan how to go about, the entire life cycle of their crops, monitor climate changes, not to talk about health sector with telemedicine and so many other things that space science is used for. So it can be used, like Earth observation basically monitors the Earth, and so you can imagine that there are different sectors that can be affected, even to oil and gas sector, like within Africa, because most African nations have oil, right? So how space technology can be used even for mining and so many other activities. So I would not say that when we go for conferences, we meet people like that, but we always, like, I think it's everybody's responsibility as a space professional to also inform people of the benefits space has, because Africa is at the point where our priorities are not exploring space right now. Our priorities are using space for socioeconomic benefits. So we have to keep educating people so they know that this technology is relatable, is within your reach. You can make use of this data because they're available.
Yeah. I think I think that's important. I think I would say for me, I don't know that is automatically what people think of when they think that their countries are engaged in space in general. We had touched on this idea of, you had Elsa, of public-private partnerships in this space, and we can talk about what that will look like more in the space sector specifically, but I want to maybe step back a bit and talk about just, could you explain what those look like and what are generally what you'd consider favorable conditions for those kinds of engagements to be successful?
Sure. So if you look at the idea of prioritizing sustainable development and leveraging partnerships, it's bringing basically between public, private, and development agencies to support Africa's space growth programs, right? So there are some fundamentals that we have to look at when it comes to PPPs. And people think PPPs are just partnerships, public and private sector partnering together. So let me demystify that a little bit from a high level. So number one, it's a long-term commitment with clearly aligned vision, goals, and objective among the public sector and the private sector, and of course, the development institutions. And you have to complement that with strong political will, transparency, and M&E. So this is the fundamental, breaking ground for public-private partnership, for favorable conditions for that to happen. And the second is the regulatory framework and implementing that regulatory framework. You can have all the policy and regulation you have, but if you don't implement it, that's critical. That's the foundational for PPP's enabling environment, especially in attracting and giving incentive to private sector. The third is equitable risk sharing. So public sector has this notion that public-private partnerships is about the private sector and coming in and investing, but it's more than that. It's about regulations. It's about equitable risk, meaning equal risks that are taken by the public and the private sector. The fourth is the long-term capital access and commitment. Okay, this is what we call a long-term marriage. The financing that you usually get are for short term. And so this is 10 to 20 years commitment. So you have to have a long-term capital access because it's very heavy on capital. And then the last but not least is the capacity building and technology transfer that people miss out on. You can have all the financing, you can have all the regulation in place, but if you don't educate and capacitate and have the knowledge transfer, then African countries cannot own. They won't have equity in that space development. They'll be basically leasers. You're leasing instead of owning. So we have to really focus about, when you look at effective public-private partnerships, how does that enable domestic African countries to have equity in that space development, as whether providing it or from the supply and the demand side. Are you providing the infrastructure for space, or are you the person or the country that's operating it? So hopefully, I'm looking at it from the downward perspective, is how do we think about it from the ownership perspective, and we're not just leasing from France, Luxembourg, or the United Arab Emirates. Thank you.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And unfortunately, I have so many more questions about some of the more practical stuff we talk about, but I want to be conscious of time and sort of look forward in a bit, and in a sense, and come back to you, Anna, and talk more about your work in this space and sort of being exposed to a wide range of players. And I want to get a sense of how young people are engaging with these kinds of issues and this sector. Are you finding that there is opportunity for young people to get involved in this space, or are you finding that they're even showing up to these conferences and talks?
Okay, so I'll take the last angle, which is if young people are showing up to conferences. Yes, we see a lot of participation, like in events, like within Africa and even foreign events, space events, where Africans are invited or the topics are also related to Africans. So yes, we can see participation with young space professionals or even enthusiasts. We also see a lot of government bodies like the African Union Commission, even the European Union, funding these young people to participate at conferences and events. So we see that happening. I spoke about private companies. So most of the private companies are also run by these young people, though we still have like space enthusiasts who have not been able to find their footing in industry, but we also have participation. In general, I'll say it's fair. We see a lot of participation from young people, but my concern really is, and which is major concern for most young professionals, that like there's still insufficient opportunities for them. Most because the African space industry is still highly run by the public sector. So we have the government bodies more active. We have very few private companies, like I mentioned, and these private companies are just in their infancy. They are unable to take on as much human capital. So you can imagine that there are not enough opportunities, and that has led to a lot of brain drain. Most of these young individuals are working in foreign organizations, or sometimes they even just leave this sector entirely because we don't have enough opportunities. But we're looking that this will change in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a story that we've definitely heard, but for across a number of sectors on the continent. So let me come to you, Imraan, and ask, if we were to try to use policy to try to affect the situation of youth involvement or participation in the sector on the continent, where would you aim most of the efforts, or like the most of the energy? Sort of at what level are we thinking in terms of getting kids excited to go study these issues, or getting people employed in this space? Where is the most need for, or where would be the most effective point of intervention, do you think? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. I think the two choices that you provide are very difficult to have to choose between. I think there's certainly a need for more policies and investments in building our capabilities and getting people, capacitated to be able to participate in the space economy. At the same time, I think there's need for policies that would allow for the mushrooming and blooming of small startups in the space in the space industry. Supportive policies, programs that would nurture and mentor space type of companies that are coming. We run a program called the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, which is an open innovation challenge. In last year's program, we managed to attract about 80 entries from young people in age cohort of less than 35 across the continent. Some really great solutions that had come out of there. And so I think that there's a very, very active and developing startup sector within the continent in the space, and taking opportunities, making use of the opportunities that is coming from the public sector, the investments and the focus in space on the through the public sector, and making use of the opportunities. I think the building of that innovation type of ecosystem is going to be an important policy element and regulatory element that I think governments are going to be focused on. But certainly the space sector, in my view, is not going to be built only by public sector investments, but really through the involvement of private sectors and small startups that are going to be coming out of this and taking advantage of the opportunities.
Well, the good news, it sounds like, is that you at least think that the interest, the demand is there, and if there's the sufficient supporting infrastructure as possible to build on that, regardless of what level we choose to prioritize investment in. I have a few more questions, but then I want to come to any questions from the audience. If you have any, you can throw them in the Zoom, And I have just a few more questions for panelists, and then we'll take those. Back to this idea of the less tangible benefits of being involved in a thing like this. I was thinking about just space launches and NASA, and how here in the States, in a sense, these launches act as a very galvanizing, unifying force, right, in the country, be it against a foreign adversary of some sort, or just promoting this idea of togetherness. And Elsa, coming from a person who's on the financing side, are these kinds of considerations ever important? Like, how would you rate, like, would building a sense of pride in Africa and our abilities, and how the most progress we made, does that matter? Does that factor into, is that good enough as a development or investment objective?
Absolutely. It's a sense of pride. I mean, when you think about what we're doing in infrastructure is to interconnect the continent, right? That's our primary goal, to interconnect so that we can have sustainable economic goals and deliver them. So similarly, you can think about Pan-African systems and on a regional and continental level, driving the AU ambitions, which is, everybody talked about SDG, but the African Union ambition is Agenda 2063. And that commitment has already commenced as a flagship. There's an African outer space strategy already in place. And like I said, that needs a lot of that partnerships, that private sector partnerships. And definitely the African Union sees it as one of the key pillars as development of an integrated and united Africa. So that's definitely a pride to this continent, and it's a goal and a flagship in the sense of space investments, and which includes the development of vibrant and integrated Africa space. And that's the goal of the Africa outer space strategy. So definitely a priority.
Imraan, what do you think is that the most effective framing for this, or do we need to sell it to people as something else, or do you think intrinsic pride is message and enough? Do you think that sells it to the public, or is there a better framing?
I think the intrinsic pride and iconic space programs are important because they're also very inspirational. They're very inspirational for young people and for them to be looking at and moving into this stuff. But I do think that you do need to sell it in a different way, and that is the benefit that all of this investment brings to people and to the lives of people and to the livelihoods of people. I think, and there's many examples of how this of how this happens, and the messaging, and to be able to do the outreach around the benefits of space, not only feeding the curiosity, but also impacting the real lives of people. How does that farmer, in some rural area, improve their crop, ability to produce good quality crops that can be taken to market and be sold at good prices? Or how do you prevent or mitigate a disaster impacting hugely on communities, a flood or something of that sort? So I think those benefits are and highlighting those benefits of space. And we've talked very much about Earth observations, but there's also this communication element of it, which is very space-based, and communications, fundamental human activity, and how space has enabled that across the continent and allowed for the leapfrogging of years of infrastructure. So I think there's many more pathways around this, coming towards this whole space, and we're probably only starting to scratch the surface of those types of things. But
yeah, it would seem that there's a fair bit of public awareness work to be done. I think there's just that people just don't know a lot of things that are going on. There's a question here that I think is, yes, please.
Before you go on, I think this is important because my perspective was just on pride, and I really wanted to add this thought to Imran's point. And I think, if you'll indulge me and go a little bit out there, drawing a parallel to the discovery of electricity. Okay, so how electricity played a pivotal role in the first industrial revolution, right? Not to say that, space and energy is equal, but energy is more pervasive and more a necessity than space. But you can think about it from the perspective of how energy had driven the first industrial revolution, and then you can look at it from perspective of how space can also have that drive in the fourth industrial revolution and benefiting regular citizens. I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Did you want to say something, Anna?
Yeah,
Please.
so I have a different opinion on the matter
Okay.
totally.
That's what we like to hear.
So I
It's
totally
good.
disagree with what they've said, because we've seen we've seen countries launch satellites, we've seen them get involved, we've gotten past the, coming into the sector. Right now, what would sustain it really is commercializing it. There's no,
Yes.
so I understand the pride, but I'm totally against any more launch of satellites by African countries. We need to think about how to commercialize it. I'm for, if you want to launch communication satellites and you have a plan to make revenue of this, I'm totally for it. For Earth observation satellites, I'm against it. There's data available. Why do you want to launch a satellite? Just get the data. We need to move past that, because any industry that is totally run by the government is struggling. It needs to be commercialized. It needs to generate revenue. That's partly why the young people do not have as much opportunities, because it is a go-funded industry. So I'm not a fan of it. I have a different opinion totally.
That is, I think that's
But
really important.
things
Please.
are owned by others, and they're not owned by us, right? We are leasers and not equity holders. And I guess that's the point we're trying to come at. Pride from a perspective as an equity holder, instead of just a leaser from all of these satellites, not to just launch a satellite, but to own it and to be the operator. I'm sorry to interject. I think it's a very important point to clarify.
Yeah, but we have 57 launch satellites owned by Africans presently. 57. Why launch more? Let's take advantage of data. 57, yeah. So
from the
I
data
totally disagree.
So by European others.
So 57 owned African satellites. So why
I
launch
guess
more?
there is, I guess the other side of this is, yeah, there are African countries involved, but we are saying that the pride comes from the nature of their involvement. So like it's a very big difference if I rent my apartment versus I own it. I think there is some qualitative differences there, but I think your point is very well taken, and we can't just be spending billions of dollars for it looking cool when we have very real fundamental objectives on the ground. Sure. There's an important question from the audience I think would be good to talk about, and maybe I'll come to you with it, Imraan. There's this idea that's, okay, so a lot of countries have been involved in space for a while. Africa is there'll be some point where every country has launch capabilities and everyone can launch things into orbit and stay there eventually at some point. The question is about sort of who will govern territory there, and how complicated can that kind of thing be over who will control more space. Is that, can you explain the stakes there, or if we're overthinking how the geopolitics will play out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too sure if I'm completely qualified to answer this question, but from my perspective, I think that there's pretty good international treaties that are at the United Nations level, the Outer Space Treaty that governs a lot of space-based activities, and within the confines of that. Of course, those treaties and the boundaries around that are being pushed by new space endeavors, and this is going to be an element that is going to come up more and more. I think the United Nations system, I think through the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, provides a good mechanism to be able to moderate and to be able to govern what is happening in outer space, and some of the conflicts that might arise out of that as well. It's a mechanism that has been in place for many decades now, right from the beginnings of human activity in space, and it's something that needs to be strengthened and adapted as well.
Great.
Yeah.
No, thanks. That helps. And there's another question here about sort of more public awareness about space programs on the continent, where I think we've maybe touched on that a bit, and just ways to make people aware of the fact that these things exist and that they are able to be engaged in it. Just because this is a policy conversation and we like to end these things with being actionable, I want to ask all of you so I'm a person who listened to this chat and I learned a lot of really important things from all of you. And I think this is important. I think my country should be a lot more involved in this space than they are. What avenues do you think exist for just the average person to want to affect this situation, right? I think about elections on the continent. Nigeria just had some, and I cannot imagine our space policy coming up at some debate or at a campaign stop. So in reality, how do Africans affect the situation? Can we, or is this one of those sad ending kind of discussions? I'll start with you, Elsa, if you don't mind.
I was waiting for you. I wanted to hear. I'm always the one coming in, so could you give the opportunity, because I'm also the novice here, and I would like to. I'm thinking a little bit more deeper on it, if you don't mind.
Sure, please. Do you want to start, Anna?
Sure. Just to clarify, so you're saying how do you mean enforce it or even develop this space
Even
policies?
just to have my voice heard on the situation, right? So I'm an African person. I do strongly believe that my country should have a space policy of some sort, of some involvement. I want to be able to have my voice heard on this. How is that possible? Is that possible? Or have we not developed to the point where these are parts of our fundamental discussions in government?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that quite a number of African countries already have space policies and strategies. We have, though less than half of them have, but we have quite a number. The challenges that we see is that these policies are not all encompassing because they don't get the right stakeholders involved when formulating these policies. So things that affect young generations are not considered. Even the private sector is quite limited because we don't have a lot of stakeholder involvement. I think the underlying factor is also the fact that Africans do not really value space. They do not see it as an important venture, and they feel like it's just, extravagancy. So it will start by first educating, even not the politician, but starting from the grassroots. So everybody sees space as something that can be used for their everyday life. From there, I think it's going to policies, because even these grassroots people have influence on the politicians. So of course, this can also affect it. But I think to even take a step further, my concern would not even just be formulating these policies, because like I mentioned, quite a number of countries have these policies. The problem is really enforcing it. These policies they are strategies that are actually amazing. I've read quite a number of them, but I don't see them being enforced, which is why the industry is how it is presently. So it will also be enforcing it, and by doing that, we'll have to elect more educated leaders who are exposed.
I will sign that policy any day of the week. Imraan, do you have thoughts?
I think this is a very, very difficult question that you're asking.
Sorry.
I don't think. I mean, honestly, I don't think that there's too many avenues at the moment for, average person on, to be able to affect and to be able to impact on countries developing space policies. I take Anna's point and I completely agree with it. I think that the whole question of the benefit and utility of space to everybody and the awareness around that is going to be a driver of demand for governments to be able to develop good space policies and strategies and policies that are actually have impacts on the daily lives of people. And as that awareness grows and as that demand grows, and people see the benefits of space, a farming community sees the benefit of having to be able to monitor their crops and their crop health through a growing season, to know when to water those crops, or when to fertilize, or when to harvest. A fishing community that can more accurately predict fishing stocks and thereby sustainably fish those. Those are going to be the sort of demand drivers for countries to be able to start developing space policies themselves. Unfortunately, at the continental level, space is, as much as it's developing, it's also very much within the scientific and the space geeky community, if I might say, the drivers of this. We need to get to a point where there's a demand and the solution has a appreciable space component to it that is going to change things.
Thank you. And last but not least, Elsa, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to be a bit of a devil's advocate and trying to look at it from a different perspective, but I think I have arrived. So my thought process is we have to look at it from a perspective of how does it benefit the average citizen? And when it benefits that average citizen is when those average citizens also go into the voting polls and say, listen, this is my priority. In order to do that, I think we have to look at, what are the benefits that from space investment, which is looking at climate change and looking at these preventative, predictive, benefits that we have from space, which is, for instance, all these climate change issues that we have, looking at Malawi, looking at all these different countries having flooding issues, have created this thought process. How do we plan for sustainable infrastructure? So infrastructure being the backbone, nobody would ever think, if you have space investment, you would actually benefit from that. Yes, you do, because you have now predictability. Yeah, you have now ideas to how to design, how to prevent these measures and have a more sustainable infrastructure. So I'll just go at it from that perspective. And last but not least, I think it's the promotion of space-related education and training programs. And that kind of opens up a new perspective that, yes, that might not be the top of the rail of our development aspect, but it truly will be in the digitalized age. And we have to prepare for that. We are playing catch up. So how do we leapfrog? And that's through the promotion of space-related education and training programs in our education system. So we have to start there in the sense of educating young people and saying, no, this is also an aspect of education. And how do we contribute to that digital age? I'll stop there.
Thank you. We are right at time, and that is a wonderful place to end the discussion. We had a few more questions, but I'm sure if you reach out to the speakers over email on LinkedIn, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions. Panel, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel significantly smarter than I was an hour ago, and that is very much thanks to you. To the audience, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next one. We have these every month, and please be sure to follow us on all the socials and look out for our panelists and their work in the future. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.
Well, are we clear?